Just closing a little bit, saves my voice. Closing that's lovely. That's lovely. Come on right round, folks. That's smashing. We're now standing at the world famous Traitor's Gate. It was built on the orders of King Edward I, for he required a safer and actually, folks, a more useful entranceway into the Tower of London. London, back in those days, was an extremely dangerous place to be, where convoys could be attacked and stores stolen and prisoners set free. So he decided to use the River Thames as a natural highway. He ordered that a hole be knocked into the outer defensive wall so that at high tide boats could pass through, unload their cargoes in safety. It was originally known, folks, as the Watergate. Do we have any Americans in the audience? I should remind you that we had one first. Now, having breached a hole in the outer defensive wall, he soon realised he had weakened his defences, and he ordered that a tower be built over the top of the archway. He had this tower named in honour of a former constable of St. Thomas of Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was in fact murdered at Canterbury Cathedral in 1170 on the orders of Edward's great-grandfather Henry. The archway that you see before you is a marvel of medieval architecture, spanning some 61 feet, having no supporting keystone to hold it up. As I have already mentioned, this was known as the Watergate. So how did it become known as Traitor's Gate? Well, it was during the Tudor period that it became an ideal spot to bring prisoners into the Tower of London, those mostly accused as traitors to the monarch. Through those gates have come no less than 3 queens of England: Queen Anne Boleyn, Queen Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey, the uncrowned queen of only 9 days. High dignitaries of the church were of course no exception. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the bishops Ridley and Latimer were all brought in through those gates during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. Now these 3 pious men, we took them to Oxford, where we burned them at the stake for heresy. Those and many more poor unfortunate souls would have made their way down the River Thames by boat or barge from their trials at London's Guildhall or the Palace of Westminster. They would have passed through those gates, they would have landed at the steps, only to be met by an escort of good-looking yeoman warders. It's always worth a try. They would then have been led under the archway of the Bloody Tower to their place of imprisonment to await whatever fate had in store for them. All too often, it resulted in them being handed over to the sheriffs of London for a short journey to their place of execution. Now behind you there, ladies and gentlemen, is the infamous Bloody Tower. Originally, folks, it was known as the Garden Tower on account that it overlooked the Lieutenant's Garden. But its name was changed to the Tower of Blood, or the Bloody Tower, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, to commemorate the many tragedies that have been enacted within. Surely the most terrible tragedy of them all was the alleged murder of the 2 boy princes in 1483. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were brought to the Tower by their uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, to prepare for the oldest boy's coronation. But sightings of these 2 young lads playing in and around the grounds became less and less until they were seen no more. It is alleged that they were murdered by being suffocated with a pillow, perhaps even stabbed to death in the upper chamber. Their small bodies were taken out by an unknown priest the following day, buried in a secret plot Underneath a staircase to the south side of the White Tower their remains lay for 191 years, until the reign of King Charles II, when workmen working in an area over there, they come upon a small wooden chest. Excitedly, they ripped it open, hoping to find lost treasure. But all that was in there were the bones of those two small boys. It was agreed by experts of the day that they were indeed the bodies of the two young princes, so he placed them in an urn designed for Sir Christopher Wren. And we took them to Innocents' Corner in Westminster Abbey, where they lay to this day. Right, we're going to leave this area now. We're going to make our way under the archway of the infamous Bloody Tower. But before we do so, I can point out to you a little bit of our medieval defensive system. It's called a portcullis, or Norman drop gate. You can see it there, that spiky thing. See it? Yep. That is over 700 years old, just like me. It weighs 2.5 tons, just like me. It is still in working order, unlike me. Ladies and gentlemen, a word of warning. As we pass under that portcullis, be careful. The rope that holds it up there is original. I'd like you lot to go first. We're going to head on the archway up the hill. We're going to stop at the steps you can see through there. I'll talk about the oldest part of the tower blood. Come on, forward to victory. I've been doing this tour for many years. I need to find something.
I'm sorry.
Yes, it is. You're right.
Why is the Wakefield Tower so cool?
Named after William de Wakefield, King's Clark III. There you go. It used to be known as the Londonderry Tower, and an honour for a constable of ours. And it's now called the Wakefield after the Battle of Wakefield, or the War of Wellington. That was where King Henry VI murdered on the 21st day of the 17th century. It's had loads of different
I used to live about 100 yards from where the Battle of Wakefield is.
Okay, so that's where Henry VI.
We lived about 100 yards from the Battle of
Just kind of halfway up, though, before we stop now. Ooh, come on round, folks, come on round, pick up all the steps, that's fine. Let's close them. It's a bit windy here, isn't it? It is. Well, that's a nice day though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a nice day for October, it's good. Good. Right, to your front is William the Conqueror's Norman Keep, known as the Great White Tower. Building work started in the year of 1078 and it took 20 years to complete. Under the direction of Gondulf of Bec, the Bishop of Rochester, he had the tower built over 90 feet high, and the walls vary in thickness from 15 feet at the base to 11 feet at the top. On each of the corners, folks, you'll notice that we have a turret. 3 of them are square, but one actually around the back is round. It's in the round one that the first Royal Observatory was established. Now on top of the turret you'll notice that we have a gold crown, underneath which is a weather vane. This shows a standard. Well, this lets us know that this is still a royal palace, although no longer, folks, a royal residence. But never lose sight of the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that kings and queens of England lived here within the walls of the Tower of London for well over 500 years. The royal family, when they were here, lived mainly on the top floor. The floor below that was a banqueting hall, a council chamber, accommodation for knights and their ladies. It is also the site of the chapel of St. John the Evangelist. Now that is one of the oldest Norman Romanesque style churches here in England. The lower floor that you see with the large windows was mainly for servants and retainers, yet we had another floor, we had it below ground level. Here stores and provisions were kept, but parts of the floor have a far more sinister past. But it's in there that the rack and other implements of torture were used on poor unfortunate souls. It was a dark, damp, evil-smelling place, lit only by the flicker of candles. I like doing that. It's my jazz hands. No sound of the cries of pain or anguish could be heard throughout those thick walls today. Very little of its sinister past remains, but we have now turned it into a gift shop. I am so sorry. I do not know why. But when you're walking around here today and you just happen to find yourself in that dark, dark, dreary place in the basement of the White Tower where we used to torture people, I want you to have a look at the lovely gifts that we have in sale. And then I want you to have a look at the price of those gifts. And you'll know that we are still torturing you. Down in there. I'm sure my bosses don't want me to say that. My story at this point would not be complete if I did not mention the ravens of the Tower of London. These large black birds are popular, familiar sight to the visitors, but no one really knows how they came about being here. But there's a legend, and the legend tells us that should the ravens leave the Tower of London, it will crumble into dust and the monarchy shall disappear. Now everybody knows this is medieval superstition and nonsense, but in the year of 1660, King Charles II was asked permission from the Observer Royal to have the ravens removed. In those days, there was a large telescope on top of the White Tower, and all the ravens up there at the time kept on fouling its lens. Now the king didn't care whether they was here or not until he was told about a legend. For you must remember, it was his father, King Charles I, who was executed on the orders of Oliver Cromwell. Now, rather than risk the anger of destiny, he ordered that 6 ravens be held in the Tower of London for evermore. Today, thankfully, we still have 6 ravens here. And of course, we're not superstitious anymore. We've got 1 extra. They're looked after by myself. I'm known as the Raven Master. Some have said Raven Mad. It's true. Yes, madam, I chop them off. Look. Yeah, some of them are. Yeah, pretty much. So there they are, all around here. Right, executions then. Let's be heading off.
I only see 5 ravens.
Oh yeah, the other one's up there on the roof. Wait for me to see.
Spreading out. How long's it been there?
About 2.5 years. Oh, we got it. Ryan watched that, doesn't he? You just watch that.
Elders. We are now standing on Tower Green. It is the village green to the Tower of London. But unlike most village greens here in England, this one that we have here is very, very special indeed. We don't have a duck pond, cricket pitch, pavilion, village fete, or even a boot fair here. But what we do have is our very own private execution site. How cool is that? Now that small paved area there is not to be confused with the public scaffold site that is indeed outside of the tower on Tower Hill here. Only 6 people were ever executed, although 3 of them folks were Queens of England. But before I tell you about them, let me describe the buildings that surround us. Down there, beyond those trees, you'll find the entranceway to the Bloody Tower, where many famous names were incarcerated behind its walls. Some of them were never to leave alive. Moving further to your right, you see that large black and cream house there. That is the King's House, a perfectly preserved Tudor residence that is still the home of the Constable of the Tower of London and his family. Now, over the passage of time, some very important prisoners have been held within those walls. Queen Catherine Howard, 5th wife to King Henry VIII. She was held there before her execution on Tower Green. Another character to be held up there on the top floor was William Penn for his offensive writings. Even though, whilst in prison, he still managed to write that controversial pamphlet, No Cross, No Crown. He was only released on condition that he left the country, so he crossed to the other side of the Atlantic, became the founder of the famous Quaker colony in Pennsylvania, named in honour of his father. Anybody from Pennsylvania here today? Anybody at all? I shall remind you folks that he was a criminal. The very last prisoner to be held here inside the walls of the Tower of London was Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer in Hitler's Nazi Germany. He was held up there on the top floor in May 1941 for 4 days. He was then moved to the countryside for his own safety for the remainder of the war. Famously, folks, he was tried in the Nuremberg trials. He was then sentenced to life imprisonment in Spandau prison. Those houses that you see, those either side of the King's House, those with the dark green doors, are now home to some of my Yeoman Water colleagues and their families. Now, to your front, this tower here, this is called the Beauchamp Tower. It's one of my favourite towers. In the basement, when you go in there today, is a display about some of the prisoners that we had here over the years inside the Tower of London. But when you go in there, use a spiral staircase. Go and visit the State Prison Room on the first floor. In there, many notable inscriptions have been carved into the stonework by prisoners over the years. Some of them are dating back over 480 years. Moving further along, you see these two houses here. The one on the left hand side is traditionally our resident doctor's house. We have a doctor on site, so we need a doctor. We lock ourselves in here at night time. That's a bit strange, I know, but we have some bling that we need to look after. So us old Yeoman Warders need looking after. So if he can't do anything, living next door to him, the chaplain, he'll be able to deal with us in the end. Now, I think the chaplain has a pretty cool job here in London, and I'll tell you why. He lives there, and he works in there. How about that for a commute? Pretty cool, that one, isn't it? So this is the Chapel Royal St. Peter ad Vincula, Latin for St. Peter in Chains. It's a beautiful chapel built during the reign of King Henry VIII, around 1519, 1520. Actually had it built for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to make her feel more comfortable when she was at prayer here, when she was visiting the Tower of London. And I'll tell you about some of those who lay to rest in there very, very shortly, okay? Behind you, this large building here is the Waterloo Barracks, or Waterloo Block as it's known nowadays. It was once the Grand Storehouse, but it was burned down by fire in 1841, and as a result of that, the Duke of Wellington ordered a replacement, and he had this built when he was comfortable here. And building work started in about 1845. It then became a home to up to 1,000 soldiers stationed here at the garrison. Nowadays, of course, it holds the exquisite crown jewels and the royal regalia. An entrance can be gained after this tour. Underneath that clock there, you find a set of doors and no queue. I think that's the first time I've not seen a queue for the crown jewels in the last 6 months. So you come on a nice quiet day. Ladies, if you get a chance to go in there today, go and have a look at His Majesty's diamonds in there. They are quite magnificent. They are, in fact, absolutely massive. Then pause for a moment and look at the ring that you may be wearing upon your finger. Look lovingly into your husband's eyes and just think to yourself, quietly ladies, of course, what a loser. Don't compare. Okay, at the far end of the square over there is Museum of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. They're an old infantry regiment. And they fought themselves up there in the square as a body of men in around about 1685. One of England's senior line infantry regiments. Had a wonderful museum. I can see it's open today. You can go inside there as well. Alright, let's turn our attentions back to our very own private execution site. Very first person to lose their head there in the year 1536 was Queen Anne Boleyn, second wife to King Henry VIII. Brought to the Tower of London under sentence of death through Traitor's Gate, she was charged with incest, adultery, witchcraft. But she was not to be beheaded with an axe, for she feared the weapon greatly, but in a French fashion with a sharp, long, double-edged sword. Now as the executioner removed her head as was tradition and held it high into the air, there was a gasp of horror from the assembled crowd. That's a lot better than the first attempt. When they noticed that so swiftly had the swordsman cut her head from her body, he took it off so cleanly, so precisely, so perfectly, that it is said and recorded in history that the lips were still moving, they were still talking in prayer, and her eyes continued to gaze around, looking longingly at the assembled audience before her. I like that story. To 1541, it was to be the turn of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. Now this dear old lady had committed no crime, neither was she afforded the luxury of a trial. She was unfortunately the mother of Cardinal Reginald Pole, and it was the Cardinal that King Henry VIII would have loved to have got his hands upon, but he was in Rome preaching against the King. So if the King could not get to the Cardinal, he therefore decided to vent his anger out on this dear old lady. Now she stood on the scaffold site there. She would not place her neck on the large block of oak, declaring quite loudly in front of everybody that it is for traitors, and I am not such. She then paused for a moment. She looked at the audience on that fateful morning and she thought about things. She bent down, she gathered up all her dresses and she ran off.
Oh my God.
Off she went around our village green as quick as she possibly could. Much to the amusement of everybody who was watching that morning, and I might add also the executioner, who then proceeded to chase her with his big heavy axe. Now folks, I need you to use your imaginations for just one moment. Them two running around our village green together, him hacking her wildly as they ran. He managed to strike her 11 times before he finally brought her down to the ground. She was indeed 68 years of age. Following year, 1542, the axe was fought twice on the same day. The first victim was Queen Catherine Howard, 5th wife to King Henry VIII, charged with associations with other men, both before and during the marriage to King Henry, but was to be an affair of a gentleman of the court by the name of Thomas Culpeper, which was to prove her downfall. Now she stood on the scaffold site there. She turned to the executioner and she said, "I die the Queen of all England, but I'd rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper."
But she died.
You can imagine Thomas just standing in the audience that and looking up and going, "I don't think you should have said that, dear." Thomas was last seen doing something a little bit like this. He was eventually taken from here. He was taken as a prisoner and he was taken to a place called Tyburn. Now Tyburn was one of our major execution sites in London at that stage. It's in the area of Marble Arch to this day. He was then sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered. And so it was Jane, the Viscountess of Rochford, her lady in waiting. She was executed immediately afterwards on the very same block of bloody oak. Her crime was knowing of the Queen's adulterous affairs but failing to pass them on to King Henry. 12 years would pass before that scaffold site would be used once more. This time the tragic and the innocent victim was a 16-year-old girl known as Lady Jane Grey. Now this poor young girl was but a pawn in a power struggle by ambitious relatives. On the death of her cousin King Edward VI, she was proclaimed Queen of all England. She ruled here at the Tower of London for 9 days. It wasn't until the rightful heir, Mary Tudor, would gain the throne back by force of arms. Now Lady Jane Grey and her young husband Lord Guildford Dudley, after their trials at London's Guildhall, were then brought back to the Tower of London under sentence of death. It is said that Lady Jane Grey was kept at number 5 Tower Green. Now that is the traditional home of the gentleman jailer. At the time of her execution is a man by the name of Nathaniel Partridge, and the gentleman jailer is normally in charge of all the prisoners that were kept in the tower. Now number 5 Tower Green is just to the right of the King's house, folks, as you look at it. It is from a first floor window that she looked out on that fateful morning to watch her young husband Lord Guildford being taken from his place of imprisonment to his own execution, not here inside the walls of the Tower of London, but a public execution, public humiliation outside on Tower Hill. A short while later, she watched this headless, bloody body come back in a hand cart for burial inside of the chapel. As if that wasn't anguish enough for this young girl of just 16. She watched the carpenters, folks, put in the scaffold site together, just there for her very own execution. It was a tragic, tragic day in English history. Now, Queen Anne Boleyn, Queen Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, and many, many more of our unfortunate characters in history are buried inside the beautiful Chapel Royal St Peter ad Vincula. Now, you'll not see any tomb or memorial for them. They're buried in unmarked graves. But if you want to know the location as to where they're buried, once you go inside there, if you do happen to go in there, there'll be an old yeoman warder sat down somewhere, this time of the afternoon asleep somewhere. Just kind of wake him up carefully and just ask him where they're buried. And he'd be more than happy to tell you. But don't tell I sent you in there. Well, that's all I have time to tell you about the fascinating stories of the Tower of London. I hope you enjoyed my tour this afternoon. You continue to enjoy the rest of your day here, this very quiet and sunny day at the Tower. If you have any questions, now's a really good time to ask my colleague inside there.